All right, so welcome everyone. We've just reached the top of the hour and we'd like to be respectful of your time today, so we will go ahead and get started. So at this time, I'm going to hand the mic over to Dr. Karen Solomon from the Higher Learning Commission to help kick us off today. Over to you, Karen.
Hi, welcome everyone. Happy Friday in February. It's a chilly day here in Chicago. We're thrilled to have you join us today. I'm Vice President and Chief Transformation Officer at the Higher Learning Commission, and I'd like to introduce my fellow colleague here. Jamie Stanessa is Vice President of Member Education in the Pure Core Service. She'll be joining us by audio today. Next slide, please. Just to give you a brief overview of what we're going to accomplish in this hour. We'll talk a little bit about the purpose of why we're running these webinars and also introduce you to the Online Learning Consortium. This is a member benefit that you'll have through all of 2021. We'll have an overview of today's topic, and then we'll allow time for question and answers. I'll facilitate those questions, so as you think about them during the webinar, don't hesitate to populate them all the way throughout. Next slide, please. Reason for having these webinars, HLC is committed to assisting our institutions to gain the skills in this unusual time that we're going through, because we want to make sure that you can assure quality wherever and however education is delivered. To help us with that, we collaborated with the Online Learning Consortium. It's been a great partnership. This is the 4th week we've been running webinars, and we've been having just great turnout, great questions, fabulous facilitators. And they can also provide resources to for your institutions as you gain more experience in distance education. So please take advantage of that. This partnership was made possible by repurposing some of our grant funds from the Lumina Foundation. They've also been a great partner with us, and they want to make sure that our institutions can provide the best quality education for students across our region. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin for some housekeeping tips. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Karen. Hi, everybody. I'm Caitlin from the OLC. Just briefly before we get started, I want to go over a few quick housekeeping items on the different communication tools we have enabled today. So you can use the chat box for general conversation with other attendees. Please note that we are in Zoom webinar, not the meeting tool, so you'll need to change your little drop down to make sure it's set to go to all panelists and attendees so that everyone in the room can see the conversation. Just a heads up, the default is all panelists, so it's easy to get mixed up. Next, you can submit any questions you might have for the presenter within the Q&A tool. Since we're expecting a large group for this webinar, your questions might get lost if you only post them in the chat. If you don't already have these open, you can access both the chat and the Q&A by clicking on their icons on the Zoom toolbar along the bottom of your screen. Lastly, there's a collaborative worksheet available if you'd like to contribute throughout the session by taking notes, sharing and collecting resources, as well as a place to continue the conversations even after this live session has ended. Your facilitator has already popped a bunch of very helpful resources in there, so take a look. I just popped that link into the chat. Lastly, we have live transcription available if you'd like to use this feature. You can enable it by clicking on the live transcript button within your Zoom meeting controls, and then you can choose whether you'd like to show subtitle, which will display captions along the bottom of your screen, or you can view the full transcript, which will display transcribed text in a sidebar, along with timestamps and speaker names. All right, so that is it for the housekeeping items. At this time, I'd like to hand the mic over to Dr. Nicole Weber, who's the Assistant Vice President of Learning for the Online Learning Consortium, to give a brief welcome and then introduce our facilitator for the webinar today. Over to you, Nicole.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. Also, welcome to everybody. I'm also in chilly Wisconsin as well. So those of you who may not be familiar with our work, the Online Learning Consortium is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the work you do in your institutions to provide quality digital, blended, and online experiences for your students. Each year, we offer conferences and events that center around networking and showcasing the work and strategies higher education leaders and innovators are leveraging to reach and teach their students. We also offer a number of programs, certificates, and workshops in our institute to learn more about and apply things like quality online teaching practices, learning sciences, and accessibility to teaching and instructional design. In addition, we also support researchers sharing their work in white papers around emerging trends in our research center and peer-reviewed publications in our online learning journal. Finally, we provide consulting services to institutions who are planning to strategically grow their blended and online programming and support academic programs as they work to ensure quality in the programs they're creating and have created. For more information on our services, please visit our website at onlinelearningconsortium.org. So with our depth of experience in digital, blended, and online learning, we were very excited to be partnering with the Higher Learning Commission on webinars to support the work you're doing in your institutions. So So I get the distinct pleasure of introducing you to our facilitator for today's session on accessible learning environments. Tori has served Midwestern institutions as an instructional designer and accessibility lead since 2015. She previously served as the senior instructional designer at Wichita State University and as an instructional design expert for the University of Missouri at Kansas City. In addition to these roles, Tori has worked as an instructional design and video consultant for various institutions, including St. Mary's College of California, Fort Scott Community College, and the University of Kansas School of Medicine. She currently serves as the manager of learning content and technology at Academic Partnerships. Tori has taught online, hybrid, face-to-face courses in social media, business writing, composition, and American literature. She is also a Quality Matters Master Reviewer and holds an OLC certificate in online teaching with a specialization in accessibility. She is passionate about creativity and inclusion in course design and training resources. We're so lucky to have her with us today. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Tori.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate it. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining in today's session. I'm really excited to talk with you all about accessible learning environments today. So, if something I say during the session spurs a thought or a question, please don't hesitate to share that information. I'd love to tackle as many questions today as I possibly can. My experience with accessibility actually began during my first instructional design position at Wichita State University. In my second year there as an instructional designer, we actually entered into an agreement with the National Federation of the Blind. And this was due to a variety of inaccessible learning environments and pieces of inaccessible learning technology. So specifically in that agreement, it was about our institution's inaccessible website, super delayed delivery of Braille textbooks, and then also inaccessible third-party content present in our actual Blackboard LMS. And under that agreement, I really learned a lot about accessibility and just became so passionate about creating accessible campus environments for students. And I've really carried that passion with me through all of my different positions, and I just plan to do that and continue that well into the future. So thanks for giving me time to introduce myself and my experience with accessibility a bit. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Alrighty, everybody. So I know it's Friday, but I couldn't let anybody relax too much. So let's start off with just a little bit of a quiz. In the chat, I'd really like to see you answer the following question. What percentage of students in higher education have disclosed their disability to their institution? What do you think? 40%, 5, 8, 20. We're getting some 20s here. Some 5% again. Alrighty, sort of all over the board here. So this will be interesting to see who ends up closest to the correct answer. Alrighty, thank you for sharing your answers to quiz question number 1. Ready for quiz question number 2. In the chat, answer the following question. What percentage of people who use video captions aren't deaf or hard of hearing? What do you think? Some 80, some 90, 95, 50, 25%. Again, already a lot of variety in answers here, so I'm really curious to see who's closest. Alrighty, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about the answers and see how close you are. So according to the Department of Education, the percentage of students in higher ed that have actually disclosed their disability to their institution is about 11%. So I did notice some of you actually put 11 in there, so bravo to you. But for others, it was actually a lot higher than 11%. So really that number means that in your courses that either you teach or design, about 1 in 10 students have really disclosed their disability. But this percentage really doesn't capture the number of students in your classroom with a disability. Researchers really estimate that between 60 to 80% of undergraduates choose not to disclose. And the reasons behind this really vary, but primarily these students just want the opportunity to blend in with all the other students in their class. They don't want to be associated with stereotypes or stigmas or really just be called out. According to Inside Higher Ed, students with disabilities say that the ignorance of faculty and staff can also make it really difficult to get the help that they need. And it makes them less willing to disclose any conditions that they might have. And in addition to that, there is a whole subset of students who might not choose to disclose because they're actually not aware that they have a disability. So it's important to remember those students as well. And for our second question, about 80% of people who use captions aren't deaf or hard of hearing. And I proudly place myself among this 80%. I love and actually prefer to watch videos with captions on, even though it drives my partner absolutely insane. Captions help me better comprehend the content on the screen. And it has the added benefit of actually helping me with accents I find difficult to understand. I love spending weekends watching British procedurals, but it can sometimes be really difficult for me to comprehend what's happening on screen. So it's really important to remember that accessible choices we make aren't just for the 10% of students that disclose their disability. It can really benefit a wide variety of students with certain learning preferences. Alrighty, next slide, please. So let's begin by defining a few terms in the context of online education. So we'll first start with accessibility, which is really the focus of today's presentation. Accessibility in online learning means that all populations of students, regardless of disability, are able to perceive, understand, navigate, and then, of course, interact with their course materials. And in addition to that, the students are able to contribute to the course without any barriers whatsoever. So courses and course content that are designed accessibly really anticipate barriers and proactively remove them. This is different than accommodations. These are more reactive and often require a student to disclose their disability. Most often, these accommodations are created for an individual, so they don't really guarantee that all barriers to access are removed. Might be a barrier here and a barrier there. Accommodations are very likely provided at your institution by something like a disability services office. For example, if you are an instructor, if you've ever received a letter from a student requesting additional time for tests, you have provided an accommodation. I think the difference between these two terms is really well illustrated in the cartoon that appears on the screen. In this image, a man is shoveling a snowy staircase, and I know some of our reps today, especially maybe those in Wisconsin, are familiar with this experience. So the man shoveling a snowy staircase has a snow-covered ramp to its left. A group of students are standing in front of the man, and a student in a wheelchair asks, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" And the man shoveling replies, "All these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you." The student in the wheelchair replies, "Well, but if you just shovel the ramp, we can all get in." In this example, the man shoveling prioritizes the staircase, which accommodates some students. He offers to accommodate the student in the wheelchair later, which does eventually grant him access, but at a later time. The student in the wheelchair recommends an accessible approach. All the students are able to use the ramp, so this should be the priority. And another term that you might hear used often in discussions about accessibility and online education is the term universal design for learning. It's often referred to as UDL. UDL is a pedagogical framework, and it really offers students flexible sort of pathways for engagement within a course. It also gives them flexibility in how they go about achieving their learning objectives in a class. So UDL is a great tool when it's paired with accessible documents and an accessible learning environment. This is really the ideal way to prepare your course for all learners. Next slide, please. So I really don't want to spend too much time discussing the legal aspect of accessibility, but I do want to touch on it as it's still a really important aspect to consider. So for many institutions, the accessibility of online documents, learning management systems, websites, and all other online offerings were not really seriously considered until more regular resolutions began to be reached with the Office of Civil Rights, or the OCR. The most common laws referenced in these common resolutions are sections 504 and 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and then also the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, of 1990, which was eventually amended in 2008. Together, these laws require that campus offerings include software, websites, videos, PDF files, basically all other instructional technology and information technology. It requires them to be accessible, and available, and this is important, to all students, faculty, staff, and visitors for whom they are offered. These agreement resolutions and lawsuits take a variety of different shapes and forms and have impacted all different types of institutions, from community colleges, Ivy League, and then of course state schools as well. If you want to learn more about these and actually dig into the resolution agreements that have been reached, I recommend checking out the link I've provided on our session's collaborative worksheet. I titled it Higher Ed Accessibility Lawsuits, Complaints, and Settlements. This is provided by the University of Minnesota. I think it's really helpful because it helps illustrate the different areas of inaccessible content that have resulted in agreements. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the laws and settlements I've just mentioned, they also frequently mention the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG or WCAG, or basically any way you want to pronounce that acronym. I've heard it said a million different ways. So the WCAG was created by the World Wide Web Consortium, and this is an international group, so this is not just the United States. These guidelines define how to make web content more accessible to people with a wide range of disabilities, which then in turn, really makes that web content more usable for everybody. It has become the absolute standard for web content accessibility. And the WCAG contains 12 guidelines, which are then organized into 4 different principles. And these principles include perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And then from there, each of those are divided into success criteria, A, AA, and AAA. And there have been, a few refreshers of these guidelines over the years because, the world of the web changes all the time and new technologies are constantly being added. So these guidelines do reflect those current changes and updates. Right now, WCAG 2.2 is actually scheduled to be published in this year, so 2021. So keep your eye out for that new publication. And make sure to check out all those additional guidelines and changes to those guidelines. The accessibility standards referenced by rubrics like the Quality Matters rubric, for example, actually use WCAG as a guideline. I've provided a link to the WC3 website over the Introduction to Web Accessibility from their perspective, if you'd like to learn more, and that's available in those collaborative notes, which Caitlin has actually linked in the chat. So next slide, please. For a moment though, I'd like everybody to sort of place these laws, these lawsuits, and the official standards on the shelf. Those are important and they are a motivating factor, but instead, I think it's just so much more helpful to focus on the amazing benefits learners can receive from accessible content. Accessibility is for those populations of users, so it really can benefit everybody. For example, you'll often hear that captions need to be provided for students who are deaf and hard of hearing. And while that is true, captions can also be useful for all populations of students. Think about that student who left his headphones at home and needs to watch a lecture in the library. How is he able to do that? He can still watch the video with captions. Another example is providing adequate color contrast on our documents or using color pretty sparingly. This can benefit students who are colorblind, but it can also benefit students or users who only have access to a black and white printer. I remember when I was an undergraduate, the library printer only printed in black and white. So sometimes when faculty members would highlight content in red font, it was impossible for me to know what to pay attention to because it just printed in black and white. Another option or example is using styles, which provides a lot of great benefits for students navigating things like websites or documents with a screen reader. But in addition to this benefit, if I'm a student using a mobile device, the use of styles and headers can make navigating my online course so much easier. There are a billion different examples out there of how accessibility can benefit everyone. So if I didn't include your favorite example here on this slide, I'd love for you to share it in the chat or on our shared document. So if you have a great example, please don't hesitate to share now. Alrighty, next slide, please. So, if we had many more hours together, I would have loved to take some time to walk you through how to actually apply accessibility in your course, just do some active practice. Unfortunately, we really only have an hour, so I did want to provide a sort of short checklist of things that you can do to help make your online learning environment a little bit more accessible. So each of these recommendations can be applied in a variety of different ways. So in documents like Word documents, PowerPoints, or Adobe PDFs. But you can also take these lessons and apply them directly in your learning management system pages as well. So first, I think the first step is to really focus on the look and feel. You utilize a clear and consistent layout and organizational structure in your documents and within your courses. So use this structure throughout your course documents and in your assessments. It can really help do things like reduce the number of clicks. And it is also helpful to anticipate where students will go to find information. Not only does it make navigation a lot easier, but it also might reduce the number of questions you receive from students. And next, select a sans serif font if possible. These include a lot of popular fonts, so things like Arial, Helvetica, and Verdana. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but Verdana. And it does exclude fonts like Times New Roman. So these are, generally considered more legible fonts. And so they can really make the process of accessing information easier for all populations of students. Next, for look and feel, and this one can be really difficult for some of us, myself included. Try to limit your use of color and always double check your color contrast. Color should really be used sparingly and shouldn't ever be the only source of emphasis in your documents and in your LMS. So for example, if you're using red to highlight text, like I mentioned earlier, be sure to also bold that text as well. So it has two indicators. On our shared document, I've also provided a link to WebAIM, which is one of my favorite resources. I recommend checking out that website for a variety of different helpful accessibility tools, but they actually provide one of my favorite color contrast checkers if you'd like to play around with the contrast ratios in your favorite documents. For look and feel, the last step is to really check your hyperlinks. So you're going to avoid providing hyperlink text that is that full, messy URL. Instead, I always recommend using descriptive hyperlinks. That's going to tell the user where they're headed when they actually click on the link. So for example, using the words "click here" as a link doesn't really tell the user where they're going, and it doesn't really make sense out of context. A link that would read something like course syllabus tells the students that when they click on that link, they'll access the course syllabus. Pretty self-explanatory. After you've taken care of some look and feel areas, you might also take a look at the documents that are provided in your course. So Microsoft products and Adobe products actually have accessibility checkers built into them that really are helpful to double check for accessibility. You will want to use your judgment for some of the errors and warnings that they give you during that checker experience. But it is a really great habit to get into, to be constantly checking those different documents. You'll also want to get in the habit of using styles in your LMS and in your documents as well. Styles are a really great way to provide structure to your content through the use of things like headings and other tags. They give a really great visual organization to your content, but then they also help students who use screen readers better navigate that content as well. So in addition to the look and feel piece and the document review, you'll also want to tackle multimedia in your courses. So things like video clips, audio clips, and images. For self-created videos, you'll want to be sure to provide edited closed captioning. But for videos that you use from a hosting platform or from other resources, things like YouTube, double check that the captions are first available and then edited. If you locate a video that doesn't have this, or maybe it's a video that you don't really want to find a replacement for, you might check out a tool called Amara, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that perfectly, but I have linked to it on our resources document. The community on Amara provides edited closed captions for a ton of uncaptioned video content on the web, and I've used it countless times. It's one of my favorite resources to turn to when I locate a video that doesn't have edited closed captioning. For audio content like songs, broadcast clips, or podcasts, you'll also want to provide a written transcript. And the last item that you'll want to check off your list is alternative text. So concise, contextual text descriptions of images provided in your documents and in your LMS. And by concise, I really mean around like 100 characters, so pretty short descriptions. These descriptions tell a user what the image is in the context in which it's provided. While you can tackle these items really in any order that you prefer, this is a pretty good list to sort of get you started on the road to accessibility. So next slide, please. So, I know that this can feel like an incredibly overwhelming task, especially at first, and it might honestly feel a little bit impossible. But, remember, accessibility is a journey and not necessarily a destination. There are always going to be things, past, present, and future, that we can work on to make more accessible. So in order to feel like you have a more manageable task ahead, I recommend starting by identifying your pain points. And you can do that using the list I just provided. If you're an instructor, maybe you know that you overuse color or you don't provide captions for your videos. If you're an instructional designer, maybe you know your department needs to beef up training around alt text. Or if you're an administrator, maybe you know that your website needs a review of styles and headers on your institution's webpage. Everyone's pain points are going to be a little bit different depending on their role and what they're trying to make accessible. Which leads me to my second point. Craft a plan using those pain points. Identify short-term and long-term goals in order to tackle those issues at a fairly reasonable rate. Maybe your short-term goal could be tackled tomorrow, while your long-term goal will take a year or two. Constructing a roadmap and then sticking with that roadmap will put you on a really great path. We often think about accessibility in terms of content that we've already created. When we talk about accessibility, we think of all of the syllabi that I need to go back and change. However, every day we are creating new documents and new content items. So it's important to start making accessible choices today. And we'll want to build accessibility into your current workflow. One recommendation that I always give is to check all of your documents for accessibility or all of your learning management pages before exiting. Doing this each time you edit will make the task a lot less tedious. And then finally, my final tip, be sure to schedule regular maintenance. Like our cars, our courses, and our online content can break down over time. So be sure to take a look back regularly, especially for those pain point items, and then ensure accessibility. I recommend placing something on your calendar every few months as a reminder. So that really concludes my overview about accessibility. So thank you guys so much for sticking with me for just a couple of slides there. So I think we're ready to move on.
Tori, thank you for that. So much great information, both what you've presented and what you've placed in the collaborative document. Really excited to think about it in terms of training, even at HLC, and how we can support our institutions and our peer reviewers and things like that. We have a few questions that have populated. I'm going to start with the first one that came in early on in the session in your comments. What percentage of instructors disclose their disability to students?
Oh, that is such a great question.
I know, it was the best kickoff question. I thought, wow, this is going to be a fun session.
Oh my goodness. I wish I had a specific percentage value for you, but that is such a good question. I was reading an article yesterday that said in professional spaces, there is estimated to be about 30% of people that have a disability, within the working world. So if you took that and applied it to higher education, it might be around 30%. That doesn't necessarily guarantee that 30% are disclosing, that actually, tells us what's happening in the higher ed space specifically for faculty. But yeah, that's such a good question and something that I desperately want to dig into now. So thank you for sharing that question with me.
And if you find some information, will you add it to the collaborative document?
Most definitely. And that's a really good reminder. This collaborative document is going to continue to be available. So as you find answers or find questions, we can continue to communicate through that document. So don't hesitate to continue to use it.
Super. Here's one. Why avoid PDF documents and what did you mean by scans?
Oh, great question. So PDF documents can sometimes be incredibly difficult to make accessible. So within Adobe, you can check a document for accessibility and it will come up with this great scan to sort of let you know what is accessible and what is inaccessible. typically with an eye towards someone using a screen reader to navigate through that document. And unfortunately, there are just a lot of challenges that come along with the software in order to make content accessible. Sometimes it can prevent students from navigating the document properly. So they might not be able to read the content accurately. It kicks them around the document as they navigate through using their tab key. And it can sometimes leave pieces of content out entirely. So it's not an ideal format to share content with students. And what I meant by scans is like scans of textbook pages or scans of documents. What that does when we scan in documents into Adobe is that it can create it just as a single image. So it prevents students from navigating through that content. They might just know that there's an image on this page, but they have no idea what the image actually says. Now, one of the tools that you can use in Adobe is you can actually take that and run it through optical character recognition, which would then create it as a text document. Now, that said, if it's like handwritten content or if it's been scanned multiple times, it's a little bit of an older document, it can be a little bit inaccurate. So it's just important to test that material before you ever share it with students. So that's not to say you can't use PDFs. That's not to say that they shouldn't be used in courses or in online spaces. They just do have a special set of challenges, and you'll want to keep those in mind.
We're going to stay on this topic. We've got a couple questions populating on this.
Okay,
So what
great.
can be done about OER, open educational resource documents, or other resources that are only available as PDFs or scans? Does this mean they cannot or should not be used?
It depends a little bit on the permissions available with that OCR content. So for some of those where you're able to use and remix that content, you can actually run it through that scan, make those changes, and make an accessible version. One of the great things about OCR is that there's a whole community there that is, really excited about online education and access. And if you have the opportunity to reach out to the person who created that document, I definitely recommend starting a dialogue there, talking about the accessibility of the content to see if they would be willing to make that content accessible themselves, or maybe even work with you to make the content accessible. I always recommend using OCRs, when it's appropriate and available. It's a great advantage for online education and for students, but it is something that you'll want to consider. None of this means that you have to put, your content on the shelf and you can't use it anymore. It just might mean that there is an additional step there in order to make sure that students can access it.
What are the copyright ramifications of using OCR to make an electronic version of a text image, such as a journal article?
Oh, that's a really good question. That's probably something that I would go to the OCR creator about before I made any official changes to the document, just to keep yourself safe before, doing any remixing. Just talk through either the provider of that OCR content, or if you can, get in touch with the person who created it as well.
Super. Given no PDF, do you have a recommendation for journal articles that are downloadable as a PDF? My experience using Save as Word makes the formatting a mess.
Yeah, that is, such a challenge. And I know that it's something that a lot of, journal article providers are sort of tackling themselves. And this goes for tons of different types of vendors. So many people are aware of the challenges that we have with accessibility, especially content that was sort of created before around 2012. A lot of that was created without an eye to accessibility. So it's likely that you'll find as you look through your course PDFs that you have journal articles that are not accessible, or might even just appear as images. I've seen that a couple of times with journal articles as well. So there are limitations there. If they have the ability to share that information through the web, sometimes screen readers are able to access the materials like through an HTML like basic version. There are, it just depends a little bit on the journal article provider. If you're not able to access materials or you're not sure about options, this is another opportunity to start that dialogue with the creator to see if they have any other options for you, if they have another way that the students might be able to access that material. So right now with accessibility, I think dialogue is probably one of the most important parts. And I wish that I could go back to my slides and add that with my Tory tips, is to add, don't be afraid of asking questions and starting those dialogues. So many people are aware of these challenges. So also, Caitlin added in the chat, and I think this is really important, your friends at the library can be so helpful for getting these articles in accessible formats. Your library representatives, instructional designers at your institution, and even people who work in the disability services office, while they typically provide accommodations, they have so much knowledge about accessibility as well. So use those brains, put them all together in order to help you make accessible content for your courses.
So with that suggestion you just made, would that be an office to maybe talk to them if you want to integrate some ancillary tools into your online course, but you're not sure if they're fully accessible?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very likely that, whoever is the sort of tool provider on your campus, whether that be an IT team or like an instructional design team or a disability services team, whoever's the owner of these tools, they have likely had conversations about accessibility with those vendors. And the vendors are required to provide documentation about the accessibility and inaccessibility of their products. So they'll likely have a lot of answers for you about, what is accessible, what is inaccessible about their product, and what their roadmap is moving forward. Don't ever assume that a vendor product is accessible. That is one of the reasons that Wichita State got into a little bit of hot water. One of the vendor pieces that was a plugin to the LMS was totally inaccessible. There were a couple of assignments with some drag and drop opportunities that had no option for a student who was using a screen reader. So that prevented them from accessing that material and that assessment at the same time as their peers. And they didn't really have an accommodation provided either. So the student was told, well, you can't really finish that assignment. So that's not the answer we're looking for. So never assume that a vendor is accessible. One of my suggestions is always to ask, what about your product is inaccessible, rather than asking, are you accessible? Are you accessible? They might be in a lot of general ways, but that doesn't give you the exact details about inaccessibility. So I always recommend asking that direct question, especially if you work a lot with vendor partnerships.
That's interesting because one of the questions is it safe to assume that e-textbooks within the last 5 years utilize best practices in accessibility? And your response just now was, you better check what's accessible or inaccessible, right? Yep.
Yeah, I definitely think that, you got to put a little bit of that on your own plate just to double check those materials. So many vendors and so many like e-text providers do a great job of making content accessible. That's not to say that they don't do a good job and that they're not aware of the issues and that they're not trying to make accessible content. But it's still something that you'll want to check. Something that I see regularly that's inaccessible in my work as an instructional designer was PowerPoints provided by textbook publishers that sort of went alongside the textbooks. And the faculty member would use these for lectures or for note-taking, whatever the case may be. And if you ran those PowerPoints through a PowerPoint scan for accessibility, you would have a whole lot of errors come up. So those are just some things to think about. And, and I wouldn't necessarily take the time out of your day to go through and make all those changes unless, you need that PowerPoint right then. Go to the vendor, go to the e-textbook rep and tell them, this content is inaccessible and we need to do this, and see what their answer is and what their response is.
Super. Can you say, let's stay on this topic a little bit. Can you say more about tools to check the accessibility of my documents and courses? What are common ones that are integrated into LMSs, and what can I do if my LMS doesn't have one?
That's a great question. So for documents, definitely within Microsoft products, the built-in accessibility checker is amazing. And I highly recommend building that piece into your workflow. So if you're using Word documents, PowerPoints, Excel, you can even check the accessibility of your emails if you want to check those as well. So you can really do that with any sort of Microsoft product. I already touched on the Adobe PDF checker, so you can also use that one as well. Within the LMSs, there are a couple of different tools sort of on the market that are talked about pretty often. The real big one is Blackboard Ally. That is I think an LTI integration that can check the accessibility of lots of different materials throughout courses. It does come with a price tag, so you might not have access to that at your institution. But if you are in talks to look for something like that, Blackboard Ally might be something to take a look at. There is also a tool called You Do It, which is a great tool from UCF, which I believe is free and can also be integrated into your LMS. And this does something very similar to Blackboard Ally. It's going to check your pages in your LMS for accessibility, look at documents, things like hyperlinks, and just give you a basic recommendation for how to remediate, each of those issues. The Canvas LMS also has a built-in accessibility checker within their rich content editor. So I don't know if you have ever seen the show Westworld before, but they have like that really crazy view of a person in a circle where their arms and legs are sort of sticking out. But if there's a little button like that in the Canvas LMS, and when you click on that, it actually runs a scan of the specific page that you're working in and gives you a list of errors and changes.
We're going to shift gears a little bit and go in a slightly different direction.
Okay.
Can you provide suggestions of how UDL principles can be applied while you design a course? What about in a course that has already been developed?
Yeah, I think UDL is a really great way to take a look at sort of the assessments piece and the engagement pieces of your course. So the accessibility piece is a little bit more of the technical piece, especially when applied to content. UDL principles are a great place to apply these principles within assessments and engagement. And one of the things that you can really do as far as, sort of getting creative with UDL is giving students different pathways to complete assessments. So, one of the more popular ones that I've seen, especially in things like composition courses, is rather than having students complete a major paper towards the end of the semester, you give your students choices and you allow them to choose something that really plays to their strengths, right? So, doing a presentation, writing a paper. I might choose that. I have my master's in literature, so I like to write a paper. So a student might choose that, might choose a presentation, might choose to put together, something a little bit more creative, like a comic book, or, some sort of visual element. It can be difficult to figure out how you might want to go about assessing that. I think that's the biggest challenge when it comes to UDL. But assuming that you can put together, a really nice way to assess the students fairly and equally, UDL is going to be a great way to give students the opportunity to, use their preferences and use their strengths in order to explore your learning objectives.
And how can instructors support learners by making their group project work more accessible?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that you can always do with group projects to improve them is giving students a little bit of choice. So this is going to play into both accessibility and UDL a little bit. If those students are given the choice, maybe with the size of the group that they're working with, who they're working with, allowing them to form those relationships early so that they can work together in a certain way or with a certain person. And then also giving a little bit of scaffolding when it comes to group projects, allowing those check-ins with students to make sure that they're on the right path. And if the student wants to explore maybe a different avenue or a different way to explore a learning objective, giving them that green light throughout those regular check-ins, I think is another way that you can sort of build in UDL with those group projects.
And then how can instructors support learners by making their quizzes or exams more accessible?
So one of the things that I see really frequently with quizzes and exams is not taking the time to include alt text on images. That's something that you'll always want to pay close attention to. So if a student is asked to analyze an image or look at an image, even though it's included in a quiz or a test, you'll still want to include some sort of alt text description for the students. Something else that you might consider is removing things like time limits from your quizzes or exams. Oftentimes we find that those are, one of the biggest and most requested accommodations for students. So removing those time limits and changing around the way that questions are presented might be a good way to sort of explore that opportunity. You can do that through large test banks of questions, maybe utilizing something like an essay question rather than a multiple choice question. Those, make it a lot easier for the students to access the information and think through the information in the way that they need to.
What if it's a course that's focused on a specific skill, say a freshman English writing course?
That's a really good question. So if it's a freshman English, writing course and their objective is specifically focused on the ability to, let's say, cite sources, that's one of the most major objectives in these courses. The citation assessment might look a little bit different. Most typically you would have the students write a research paper, have a list of citations, and that would be sort of how you'd assess that. But maybe you could go about it in a different way. You could have the students explore those citations in the typical paper fashion, or they could take some sort of quiz, or they could put the citations together in a presentation where they're asked to pretend as if they were teaching other students in the class how to cite information. Different ways like that where they're still practicing their citation, they're still learning that information, but they're accomplishing the objective in slightly different ways.
What accessibility issues arise with Excel projects? I've been told not to use tables in my courses because they're not accessible. Is that completely accurate? If so, what alternatives are there for using tables?
So that's not completely accurate. Tables can be made accessible, but like with PDFs, tables can be more challenging when it comes to accessibility. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't use tables. It just means that you should use them sparingly, and you should also check them regularly. So this is part of that workflow piece. If you're going to be using tables in something like a Word document or in an Excel spreadsheet, just be sure to run those accessibility checkers and remediate any errors that you might find as you work. Some of the things that you might find if you work with a lot of tables is things like merged and split cells can throw you warnings when it comes to accessibility. So if you do that frequently with tables, you might want to readjust how the tabled information is presented. Something else that gives an error pretty often is that you won't have a header row within your table. So if you are presenting tabled content, you'll want to have a header row at the top that explains the purpose of each of those columns, so that the student using a screen reader understands, where they are in the table as they navigate through it.
Let's switch a little bit more away from the techniques and tools and things like that. But how do you encourage more faculty to think beyond just compliance? What strategies do you suggest to create awareness on an institutional level?
And I think that is such a good question. And I think it really gets to the heart of what accessibility is. I wanted to touch on laws today. I wanted to touch on, why legally it's important. But I don't know that that is one of the best ways to tackle this issue with faculty members.
Right.
In so many presentations that I've had about accessibility or training sessions and things like that, I start talking about the law and I just see that glazed look in everyone's eye. And it doesn't really get to the person behind the disability. So I think reframing your argument and talking about the advantages of accessibility for a lot of different users can be really helpful. I think illustrating things like captions and why they're useful for a variety of populations can be helpful. So if I'm talking about captions with a group of faculty members and they're saying, edited captions aren't worth my time, I can't handle that. One of the things that I always like to use is personal anecdotes of why it's important. So my most favorite one is when I was creating training videos for Blackboard for one of the institutions I worked for. I kept saying the word Blackboard over and over and over again, and the board portion of that word became porn in YouTube. So it had that word over and over and over again in my captions. And if I hadn't taken the time to edit that, I was going to send that out to faculty and students across our institution. I mean, we can rely on these pieces of technology in some ways, but we still have to include that human element. And it's important that the students are accessing that content at the same time. And we're also not getting into hot water with, inappropriate captions and things like that. You can also talk about, the human element. So using those illustrative points about, different users using captions. You can think about the student who forgot their headphones. You can think about the new mom who's up late, breastfeeding, and she wants to watch TV because it's 3 a.m., but she doesn't want to wake her partner up. She can watch TV with captions. Thinking about the students who are ESL, who really need those captions to help with comprehension, to help with things like spelling, specific terms. It's benefiting all of those students too. So lots of different opportunities to make your course a more comfortable learning environment for everyone who walks through the door. It can be a real challenge to get people on your side when it comes to accessibility, but I think telling those stories and using those examples can be really helpful, especially if you can get the faculty member to sort of put themselves in
Right.
those shoes.
Right.
Definitely.
Because most of the faculty want their students to be successful in their courses.
100%. That's why we're here.
Not intending to put up barriers or to make it more complicated. It's that awareness that I think is so incredibly important. And many faculty, once they hear about that or see that there are some ways to make some changes, will typically jump on that opportunity.
Most definitely. Yes, I totally agree. We're all here for the success of the student. So framing it about student success, I think will give you so much more, it will help your advocacy so much more than just pointing to the law and saying, we have to do this. That is important, but it's about the students.
Yes, absolutely. And so earlier in the presentation, you mentioned students find it difficult coming to instructors. What can we do to make it easier for them to come to us about their learning needs?
That's a really good question. I think that creating a really comfortable learning environment right off the bat from the very beginning of the course is, something that you want to do, whether it be an online course, a face-to-face, blended hybrid, whatever the case may be. Creating that open and sort of safe space for students to share with you is always going to be a really good way to do that. You'll want to include, of course, a disability services statement in your syllabus so that the students know how to access disability services. And if they are interested in disclosing their disability, they can do that. But also you might mention this in your introductory video in an online course or your welcome email to students saying, hey, if there is a need for an accommodation, please don't hesitate to come to me. I'd love to work with you. And we just need to have a quick chit chat. And we can do that in whatever space you feel comfortable. It doesn't have to be office hours. It can be through email. I can meet with you with disability services through Zoom, whatever the case may be. But creating that sort of safe environment for students to disclose is going to be really important.
And there's a question up here. I was just going to ask it a little bit later, but I'm going to do it now. In end of course surveys, do you support asking students for their input on accessibility? But it also may go to that sort of pre-course survey or front end of course. Can you talk a little bit about that end of course survey, and also maybe pre-survey?
Yeah, and that's such a wonderful idea, and something I think that if you are part of the advocacy for accessibility on your campus and you can go to an administrator to add something like that to an official course review, that would be so amazing. I know that a lot of us do sort of informal surveying of our students at the beginning of courses and at the end of courses. So if it's not an official piece of your survey at your institution, I think that would be such a great question to ask students. Are there pieces of technology or areas of courses that pose particular challenges for you? That might be a way to ask that question that isn't so pointed, especially with an eye towards disability. Maybe the students will say something like, I love lecture content, but I do need those captions, or I really prefer having a transcript or something like that. It might give you an idea of different accessible changes you might be able to make in the course as you teach it, or during the post-course survey, future iterations of the course that you would teach later on. So just asking them, what their thoughts are, and if they have additional ideas. I love that for accessibility. I love that for assessments, for content. Yes. Ask those students and engage with them.
Absolutely. And so sticking with this concept of getting students to disclose and share that information so we can assist them in the best way possible, do students need medical clearance to request accommodation? This question asks for a disability, but not all accommodations are for disabilities. How about if someone does not want medical diagnosis because of stigmatization?
Those are really great questions.
Yeah.
So at least for the institutions that I have worked at, in order for students to receive an official accommodation from the institution, they did have to disclose and they did have to provide some sort of like medical record or basically like a doctor's note. So something fairly simple, but they did have to communicate that to the Disability Services Office. That specific information was not shared with faculty members. So that was between the students and the Disability Services representative. But then in order for them to receive those specific accommodations, they would have to go to Disability Services, give their medical information, and it depended on the institution what degree and what level they had to give for that diagnosis. And then they would receive the official accommodation. And the Disability Services Office had, some sort of system to decide what accommodations they would receive. They'd work with the student and talk through those options. So those are really those official accommodations given, because the student comes with a letter. It basically just gives them a little bit of power to advocate for themselves. But I think that's one of the problems with just relying on accommodations is that students might not feel comfortable disclosing that medical diagnosis. They might feel uncomfortable advocating for themselves with a faculty member or with a staff member at an institution. So creating an accessible environment that doesn't require accommodations removes those barriers for students and makes it a much more comfortable environment for them. You might check with your own Disability Services Office on your campus to find out what the requirements are for students for disclosure, just to get comfortable with what your institution's policy is. For me, all institutions I've ever worked for did require some sort of medical information in order to receive an accommodation.
Well, and I think your example of the nursing mother watching a video in the evening is another great example of thinking about your student population and when they can be learning, and just thinking about accessibility, not just for those that are required to receive accommodations, but for others that it would be a benefit for their learning experience. It's great. Yes, many of the chats lighten up here with what institutions require or allow or things like that, as far as that goes.
Yes.
Well, we're almost at the top of the hour here. I have one final question in the Q&A, so we're going to swing back to that one. And this is a one back about PowerPoints again, but we've had such a great array of questions. Oh my gosh,
Yes,
so many topics.
awesome.
This has been wonderful. Thank you everyone for participating. So if the PowerPoint is not accessible, should we not make them available to the class in a file format?
So this I think is a little bit different depending on the person you're talking about accessibility with. For some, they would say never provide inaccessible content. My response would be, have a roadmap and a plan to make that content accessible. Provide the inaccessible content to students, but then always, with the caveat that if you need this in an accessible format, please let me know so that I can accommodate you. So that, if there is a PowerPoint that is inaccessible, I can do that quickly and make that accommodation for you. But, with an eye towards the fact that you do have a roadmap in order to make all of this content accessible, maybe the next time you offer the course. I don't ever want faculty to lose out on the content that they have, but we need to have a plan when it comes to accessibility. So always know what content is inaccessible, how you'd go about making that accessible, and what types of accommodations you might need to provide sort of just in time for certain populations of students.
Tori, that's it. And we're right almost at the top of the hour. Oh my gosh, this has been one of the fastest hours that we just flew through so many different topics. It was just an amazing webinar. Thank you so much. I appreciate hearing about how we can support our faculty and how our faculty then can support students so they can be as successful as possible. On behalf of HLC and OLC, thank you for sharing all of your wisdom with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such great participation. Please don't forget that you can continue to communicate in that shared document, ask questions, be curious, and continue dialogues about accessibility for sure. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.